Hey there. My name is Dean Walker. I'm founder of a little organization here on the interwebs called Living Resilience. And this particular episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, obviously a YouTube channel, this is a return to a couple of different threads that we've been holding for a number of years now as we've been providing resources and practices for the collapse aware and collapse acceptant communities for years. And the threads that I wanted to just mention here, because it might be new to you if you're new to this podcast or to the Living Resilience website or community space. Now we have a Mighty Networks space that you can find out all about the various offerings down in the show notes. But the threads that I particularly wanted to mention was, for about 8 years now, we've been offering courses and events and support groups and so on. We've also offered a kind of a sister podcast or a parallel podcast and curated content to serve collapse aware and collapse acceptant parents and children. Because while I'm not a parent, never have been, but I've always had a very soft spot in my heart for what I consider to be one of the toughest jobs on the planet, and now gotten even tougher since clearly the existential issues that are plaguing us, the issues of predicament and collapse and wicked problems and so on. How on earth do you raise a child to make sense of that when we as community members or you as parents have oftentimes a big challenge on your hands just to make sense of these predicaments and incidents of collapse for yourselves. So I'm very pleased to be having this conversation with mother and therapist and deeply committed community member in the Northern California community near Santa Rosa. This is a conversation that I think is vital for all of us at some level or another, whether we're parents or not. This is about the core skills at the most basic level when a community is challenged. And even if your community hasn't been challenged yet, it's just a matter of time, whether it's extreme weather, it's a fire, it's drought, it's floods, you know the routine. So I just wanted to give a special introduction to Jenni Silverstein, again, a mother, committed community member, contributor to her community in so many ways that we'll hear about. And I invite you to come and check out our newest introductory course, which includes this basic level of resilience skills of self-regulation and co-regulation and how we can be more and more present in the face of larger and larger stressors. And we can do that work together. So this is just a small sampling of one part of that conversation. I hope you find it useful, and hope you'll leave comments in the show notes below. And just welcome. I hope this is as valuable for you as it was for me. And please do add suggestions of the types of topics that you'd like to see us cover in this coming year, and also some of the people who are good exemplars of that robust, more and more robust reclaiming of center and being able to presence ourselves, be present ourselves in the face of predicament level collapse. Thank you and enjoy. I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament, let's welcome Jenni Silverstein. She's from the Northern California area, and she is a mother and a therapist and a very active member of her community. And she is someone able to articulate and curate and create whole new ideas about how we can self-regulate and co-regulate and generate resilience skills in the face of an ever-growing predicament. Welcome, Jenni Silverstein.
Ah,
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another round of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And it's been a while for those of you who are regulars of watching this series. I've been posting a lot of historical context pieces, some old film clips, some new stuff, some what I call the sober data of what's going on in our world. And it's been a while since I've actually been with somebody in real time in an interview. And so, Jenni Silverstein, thank you for joining us, joining me here in our Poetry of Predicament world. And we've had the chance to recently meet in an odd kind of little enclave online that a buddy of mine, Mark Skelding, has been putting together. He calls it the Bates Motel, and it has some vague connection with the oddness of Alfred Hitchcock's movie Psycho, which I still don't quite understand. It's a little uncomfortable for me, but I love the guy, and I keep really appreciating the people that come to the roughly monthly-ish meetings that we do, and they're always rich because we're all from very different perspectives and different life experiences and professions, for that matter. And there were a couple of folks in that last meeting where you and I got to meet. And you're one of those folks that I reached out to connect with afterwards, because it just seemed like there was more, certainly, that I wanted to know about you. I had just this warm curiosity of like, wow, I really appreciated your perspective and what you were describing as your personal history, your professional history, your current circumstances. And so many of them overlap with what I would call really the perfect audience for this work, either to be a part of presenting to that audience or a part of the audience one way or another. It's a loosely affiliated group of kindred spirits from all over the place. Particularly, we did get a chance to talk a bit before this, and a few of the pieces that really rang a bell for me. One is that you are a mental health professional and you are a mom, and you're in a relationship ongoingly. You're in a community, which I had some experience with in the greater Sonoma County, Santa Rosa, even close to Windsor for a time. And that means more than just a little travelogue for people who aren't familiar with this area. I live in Southern Oregon, and that's not too terribly far from that part of California that you are from. And there have been plenty of signs and symptoms of a lot of stressed conditions in our environment. I'm a little tired of saying the words climate change, because to me it's a very small sliver of and a symptom of a much greater wicked problem or predicament that we find ourselves in around the world. For even more so for you than my area, fires, like devastating fires in your area just a few years ago. There was a pretty big firestorm here in Southern Oregon, in the Rogue Valley where I live, about 3 years ago now. And in fact, I've been leading a grief group through a local grief support organization called Winter Spring each year at the anniversary of that firestorm. So these are again, it's not just travelogue, like, hey, I'm sort of introducing you and sort of, you know, telling folks where you're from, where I'm from. Um, there are some really large scale concerns that I believe we're both pretty aware of. And that's really why I wanted you to come back after our first round of just getting to know you conversation. Is I respect that you have some awareness of what the resources are in your area
Mhm.
for various populations, but especially folks like yourself, parents and concerned, just, regular folks in a community. And yet you also have some considerable experience of your own inner resources and helping others to develop their inner resources. And I am not a parent, but I have been involved with youth programs my entire life, troubled youth in the programs in the UK and the US. Ever since I've created this body of work about 8 years ago, I have always had a kind of a parallel track program for parents in particular, because I think as I look at it, I can't imagine a more difficult job in these times than how do you make sense for, how do you create a safe environment for learning and a nourishing and a thriving environment for a young person when all you and I have ever grown up with was that each generation would have it better than the last, and we'd have this endless growth on a finite planet, and everything's super pooky here in the USA. And we're clearly getting louder and louder signals that those salad days are over, and there are immense ripples in the force, so to speak. There's as I often say in my little elevator pitch, we are in the midst of human caused collapse of both Earth and human systems. So thank you for sitting through all that. I really appreciate it. I wanted to give people a sense of how I got to know you and why I wanted you to be here to speak with us and to share what you see, what you notice, what you are feeling from your perspective. And so, if you wouldn't mind just starting out with a little bit of introducing yourself and a little bit of,
Sure.
what you do professionally and a little bit
Mhm.
of what historical context brings you to places like that Bates Motel that I was talking about and weird conversations like this. And so, thanks so much for being here. And would you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
So, officially, my profession is licensed clinical social worker, and
Mm,
I'm also an infant family mental health specialist. So, my focus of work has always been the really little ones and that transition into
mm,
parenthood and
mhm.
parents of really little ones. And before I became a social worker, I actually apprenticed with midwives, home birth midwifery. So I have a lot of really wonderful
Yeah.
experiences in my young adulthood of witnessing birth, which is one of the greatest spiritual experiences I have ever had. And always wanted to be a parent. I was uh, surrounding myself by that experience long before I became a parent myself. So by the time I was in my late 30s and pregnant with my daughter, she was just so longed for. I just this little being that I'd always dreamed into the world.
Mhm.
And the year I was pregnant with her was the year that the drought got really severe
Mm,
here in Northern California. It really didn't rain that entire, I think, January to March, which is highly, I mean, this at this point, it's not unusual, but it was highly
mhm.
unusual. That really is our rainy season. And I was early in my pregnancy, and I remember I felt this dread like deep in my bones. And when I thought about it, I thought, this is this is in my DNA. Like in another time in human history, pregnancy would not survive a drought this bad, or an infant would not survive a drought this bad. And like that was the level of terror that I was feeling. And even though I had always cared really deeply about all of the things we commonly care, you and I both care about, and always kind of assumed claps. Like as a young adult, I never imagined that this system was going to be the same by my retirement age. I mean, now that I'm middle-aged, a lot of people would probably say I made a mistake because I haven't saved anything for retirement. I just never assumed that I was going to be retiring into this system. So I've always assumed claps. I've always cared deeply about all of the threats to our living world. But there was something about becoming a parent that
Mm,
just blew all of that wide open.
mm,
Really brought up levels of my own, uh, again, terror that I hadn't anticipated. And then guilt, because I had very intentionally brought this person into the world. And then I was facing, what kind of world am I bringing her into? And so that has underlined, at this point she's 9, and so that's been, the developmental process of my parenting from the beginning, and just increasingly began to influence my professional life.
mm,
um, and then in 2017, when my daughter was 3, we had our first big fire, which you referenced here in Sonoma County, the Tubbs fire, which flew through Santa Rosa and destroyed a lot of structures, and there was loss of life. And since then, we've had a number of big fires. So with the first time that we evacuated and dealt with smoke, that significantly, my daughter was 3. And then in the years that followed, it happened repeatedly. And so there was a big shift in my community, a big shift in what I saw as the mental health needs and how therapy was practiced. And I can get into all of that as well if you would like. But it's been really, in some ways, very interesting to watch the community response since Tubbs, because I often think that Sonoma County was one of the first communities that's fairly well resourced
mm.
to have that level of destruction. We certainly were not amongst the first to have that level of destruction at all, but it's a very wealthy community
Right.
overall. Housing prices are extraordinarily high here. It, and so seeing how a wealthy community, or a community that had wealth within it in some enclaves, has responded to that level of climate disaster has been really interesting. Some very great programming, I think, has come out of that over time. And then on the other hand, the folks who had the most risk and were most on the margins, like, that's only gotten harder and worse. So I think there's uh and I can get into that more too if you would like. So
Mhm.
we can go a lot of different directions here.
Well, good. I hope that people who are watching this are getting a sense of the scale of the destruction that you're talking about. I'm when I mentioned the fire storm that came through Southern Oregon, this um, excuse me, this Rogue Valley here in Southern Oregon. I want to say there's maybe 200,000 people in the entire Rogue Valley. The central point is the Medford is the largest city, and some people may have heard of Ashland, Oregon. It's a pretty well-known touristy place, and so on. And over the course of 2 days during the destruction of the fire, about 10,000 people, one way or another, were burned out of either their homes, like they owned it, or a rental, and it was a massive impact. That's all I can really say. The Tubbs fire it just dropped my jaw as I heard about it from hundreds of miles away, because I knew those areas and I knew how fast it was spreading. It was insane.
Mhm.
It was fast here, it was big here, but you're talking about something um, really hard for me to get my head around because I know Santa Rosa very, very well.
Right.
Anyway, um, I would say yes. to any of the threads and really just trust your gut about what resonates for you as something that was a thread that has continued to grow
Mhm.
about what you're aware of, what it looks like it would be foolish to not keep paying attention
Mm.
to perhaps some of the resources at any point, because it's something I've just noticed in talking with you. You are a well-resourced person.
Mm.
And for those who aren't familiar with that kind of lingo, it's just a way of saying you have inner resources you can call on, that you can self-regulate, you can bring yourself back to center,
Mhm.
even when something it's scary, it's daunting, it's even close to traumatic and so on. If someone's well resourced, there's more and more of a chance that they can bring themselves back to center, bring their awareness from that pinched down emergency traumatized look and feel of a person's system. And I'm doing this shaking and so on. And there's it's hard for me to express in my experience over time, and that when I've been in that kind of a bodily state, that I'm useless to the people I love. I'm useless to the people around me, and I'm useless to myself the more I am embodying that level of tension or trauma or fear and so on. You've shared with us a bunch, and thank you. That's exactly what I was hoping for. You gave us a sense of what you've done in your professional life and your personal life, your family life. And I've just mentioned a couple of distinctions about, what I my whole body of work starts with offering people these what I call first aid level resilience skills,
Mm.
basic self-regulation,
Yeah,
basic co-regulation, and it builds from there if people want to stick around and do this kind of work together.
absolutely.
Um, I'd be curious if you would take any seedling that I've just offered out in a recap,
Mhm.
and what rang a bell for you? What would you like to say more about? Or yeah.
Well, I can speak to what I find are my best inner resources for starters.
Right.
And for me, for a very long time, that has always been connecting to the natural world and in particular trees. I'm just very drawn to trees.
Mm,
And I find that I can sit beside any tree and take a few deep breaths and feel a connection with that being that
mhm,
I find incredibly resourceful because they're ancient and they're wise and they're strong and they're rooted underground and connected to all the other trees around underground. And I mean, you could take the visualization in one of many, many directions. And it gives me a sense of relief, a sense of being held by something bigger.
mhm,
And so that is my number one go-to. Um, and in my work with children, I work as much as I can outdoors on a therapeutic farm. And so there's farm animals that we can say hello to, and there's gardens. And this time of year, there's tons of berries. And
mhm,
uh, it is, in terms of co-regulation, it is
mhm.
incredibly regulating to pick berries when
Yeah,
you are trying to have a conversation about something difficult. And I think that that is ancient,
yeah,
like we
yeah,
have stood side by side and harvested and gathered forever. And it is regulating because it's rhythmic movement, which really regulates the lower parts of our brains. And it feels safer to communicate when you're side by side. I mean, there's just so many reasons why I love berry season. In terms of my work as a therapist, I feel like it's the most productive time of the year. So in terms of co-regulating, I just rely so much on the more than human, and being outdoors in the natural world as much as we can. And so I also will say most of my work is with very young children. And my specialty at this point in my career has been children with complex trauma. So little ones who've really been through just way too much rough stuff, way
Yeah.
too young.
Yeah.
And and one of the biggest challenges that a young person has when they've had that kind of beginning is that relationships are not always regulating. Like for me, when I think about me being well resourced, to be perfectly honest, where I go is like, boy, my dad did a great job. Like when
Mhm.
I'm leaning against a tree and really feeling that comfort, I'm tapping right into what it felt like to be in his arms,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the work I do often is with children who just don't have that experience, and instead have often experienced their earliest relationships either as threatening or as not available to meet their basic needs, or both. And so helping young people, and then as we age, to kind of find that inner resource when the beginnings have been tough. That's really been kind of the
Mhm.
heart of the work I've been doing until now. And I say until now because the unraveling and the collapse in the climate work is pushing me away from doing individual therapy
Mhm.
and wanting to take a broader systemic approach to the same thing.
Mhm.
Um, um, so really, when I think of what can help us have those inner resources, I think about belonging. Like, where can we get that sense of belonging? And if it's not with other humans, is it, with our cat or dog? Is it with the
Right.
plants in our garden? There's other ways we can access that besides humans.
Mhm.
But ideally, we have a human community from the beginning that, loves us and offers us that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And what you're saying about picking berries and so on. Yeah, it's that's as good as it gets in terms of, if we all had a little garden, a little farm, a little, place where animals and plants and edibles are, that would be a lovely thing. And sometimes we're not so lucky, some we don't have that kind of stuff around. I'm I'm noticing that I want to just mention, since I don't have much in the way of local farms, I have a couple of little raised beds in the back of my house here. Another way of co-regulating that is a bit more available in my neighborhood is to share food with one another, just
Mm,
to find a way, ideally, if there could be a little bit of cooking together as well, because that's half the fun, or maybe even more so for me. These are tending to be the types of resilience skills or co-regulation or self-regulation skills that I'm finding useful in my own practices, and I'm finding more and more interest in the folks who do my online courses, or these kind of things. Sometimes it just gets down to being that simple. Like, what if you could start having, post pandemic, what if we actually got together with other people now a bit more? And what if we were to cook together? What if we were to eat together? And what if there was just little by little a bit more conversation about connection, about, I know this is going to sound really basic to you. I'm guessing anyway, but for a lot of people, just doing a check in around the table as we begin to share the meal, like, how have you been? Since we've seen you last, and what's going on? And to be able to know that each person will have a chance to share, and
mhm,
that sort of thing. It starts so basic, but I feel inclined to just kind of underscore it, because we need every bit of these kind of resilient skills that we can have now and into our future. So I just wanted to, yeah, underscore the simplest ones from
mhm,
my perspective for a moment.
mhm. Um, mentioning a check-in just reminded me of, I was kind of chuckling when you were saying that, because yes, to me it is kind of a given in that I have been in a profession where that's a given. Like if
Yeah.
you are meeting with a group of therapists, you always start with a check-in. That is just the fundamental. But over the past year, I had the opportunity to participate in a program here in Sonoma County called the Leadership Institute for Just and Resilient Communities. And it was a
Yeah.
wonderful experience because it got me out of that mental health silo for the first time in a long time. Anyone who had interest in exploring, what does it mean to be a leader into the great turning, into this time,
Yeah.
um, was welcome to join. And it was people from across the sciences and a lot of people who work for the county, and so they weren't clinicians. And the idea of starting every meeting with a check-in was uncomfortable and unfamiliar at first,
Mm.
but wonderful, and built community. And in the end, everybody wanted it,
Mhm. Mhm.
and so I got to really see, like, oh, this is, it feels basic to me. It feels like a given. And yet, there's whole swaths of most of society
Yeah.
where that is not how you start your business meeting. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Before I take another step in the direction of what we both, if we could both share a bit about what we see out ahead and how could we kind of upgrade our family or our neighborhood or our personal skills, our personal resources, and perhaps even speak a little bit about what we see out ahead. I think it's useful because again, I just think you are kind of a great example of someone who has taken the time to really build out the inner resources that you got from your family, like you mentioned, from your dad and so on, but also professionally and now just experientially right in the middle of your family every day.
Mhm.
Is there anything else that you uh, could kind of wrap up? We both been kind of looking back and looking at what got us both here and what we've been doing, what we've been offering, because it seemed like you nudged us into, so what's the next step if a person's gone about as far as they want to go? It's not quite how you said it about your own career track, but it seemed like you were saying it's time for a shift.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to just say to complete that kind of looking back a little bit and the historical context, or if not, if you would tell us a little bit about what you're seeing as a shift for you.
Sure. Well, the thing I would add, I think, about the looking back is that, um, so I mentioned that I primarily work with young children who've experienced trauma, and up until 2017, that was a really specific segment of the population. To bring in a child under 5 into therapy, almost exclusively, it was children who were in or had been through the foster care system, because that's where that relational trauma often unfolds. And they'd been removed from households that weren't safe. And um, after the Tubbs fire, all of a sudden I was getting phone calls from parents who had otherwise, functional, by the standards of this culture,
Mhm.
healthy, functional families,
Mhm.
um, and their children were experiencing anxiety and trauma symptoms as a result of the fire, and they were looking for that kind of support. And my practice quickly filled up, and all of my colleagues who work with children, their practices, we have essentially all had wait lists ever since. Things have only, as you mentioned, gotten harder. There have been a lot of
Yeah.
other fires, there's been COVID, there's
Yeah.
been just a general increase in community level trauma across the board. And it just became more and more clear to me that for many, many reasons, the model of individualized therapy is inefficient, first of
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
There's never going to be enough of us. There's only, that problem is going to keep growing. And then once I opened my eyes to that, I really also started being able to see the ways that it is helping to create the things that we actually want to change. That there's a lot about treating people individually, even though as a child therapist, I never really did. You cannot treat a child under 5 without involving their family. So I'm really
Mhm.
talking about, dyadic, at least the child and one caregiver at all times. But even that really is just putting a Band-Aid on uh, emotional challenges that are coming from larger systemic issues. And I've
Mm.
just gotten increasingly frustrated
Mhm.
with that. It feels like I had an image about a year and a half ago or so of standing at a breaking dam trying to plug my finger in a hole to keep the whole thing from exploding. That's what it feels like to be a child therapist or a
Yeah.
therapist for postpartum moms at this moment in time. It's
Mhm.
there's absolutely no way that two individuals can work together to solve these problems. At most we can maybe put on a Band-Aid. And
Mm.
so I started really thinking about, how do I take this skill set, which has a lot of value, and start applying it in a broader way
Mhm.
to reach community. Um, and so that's the direction I'm headed.
All right. Can you say anything about the threads that you're starting to weave together? Like, how
Mm,
is that still therapy in a group setting, or is it to create programming that
mm.
possibly recorded, or classroom settings, or seminar settings, or I'm just not really clear how you expand out.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm still discovering that. But one
Okay.
of the things that has been a huge impact for me is I've done some training with Dr. Bruce Perry, who
Mhm.
does the neurosequential model of initially therapeutics, but he's expanded out quite a bit. And his work is really about neurodevelopment and how trauma impacts the developing brain. And with the mission of getting that awareness and understanding out to as much of the community as we can. And the idea that every adult who interacts with a child has, if every adult who interacted with a child had some awareness of trauma and how trauma is influencing the behaviors we see and the other diagnoses they get and the personality that they seem to develop, then that child could be seen and understood more, and hopefully develop that sense of belonging more. So I really took my cue from him, and years ago, before I really started going down this path, I started doing a lot of trainings in trauma responsiveness, with just the idea of there's absolutely no way that I, in an hour a week, can single-handedly help a child resolve a complex trauma history. Their community has to be on board. And so I've done a lot of trainings for preschool teachers and elementary school teachers, and kind of anyone who will listen. you know? um, and I've been doing that for years. So that's where I'm at now, is a natural extension of that. And what I really find myself thinking about at this point is, I think in some ways akin to Bob Doppelt's like public health model for community resilience. It's like,
Mhm.
how do we help develop spaces where there can be a sense of belonging and community and resources, from the most basic, feeding each other on up, um, for all of the children around us, because the need is only growing. And at the same time, the systems are starting to unravel and there's more isolation. I mean, just to go back to the beginning of our conversation, one of the things that happens on a smoky day is that you can't play outside. So all of a sudden, there you are stuck indoors all day as a young child. And the parents are still expected to be working, all that kind of stuff. When there was a lot of smoke on the East Coast this summer, I had some friends back there who were saying like it's summer. And in summer, if you're going to camp, it's outdoors.
Mhm.
And so there were days where that just wasn't possible. And the parents were still supposed to be working. So now the child, doesn't really have their parents because the parents are on a Zoom call, doesn't have their summer camp, doesn't really have anything
Yeah.
to connect with relationally in those moments. And we're seeing so much more of that. And it's a
Yeah.
community level trauma. It's society level trauma. And so one of the directions that I'm really interested in going is creating like community resilience programming. Like, can we find locations where there can be gathering places that are, have good air quality and have solar power so we can keep that quality going, and where people know that they can bring their young children and have a safe place to be and actually interact with other parents and young children at the same time. And I think there's so many potential things we could do with something like that. Finding the funding, and there's actually some funding coming down through the state of California to create like community resilience centers. So it's not impossible at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've mentioned a couple of names. I don't know the work of, I think you said Bruce Perry, and I'm happy to look that up, and I'll be including these links to each of the people you've been talking about in the show notes. I do have a kind of a long history of tracking with Bob Doppelt's work. I first bumped into his major book, the Transformational Resilience, and I that came around the same time that I was just finishing up writing my own book about this whole situation that we're in globally, and it's called the Impossible Conversation: Choosing Reconnection and Resilience at the End of Business as Usual. And I, I I'm no expert in all this. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a community development specialist. I'm, none of those things. So I just started to ask questions like, who's already doing stuff? Can I find somebody who's doing what they're doing that can make an impact at any level here? One of the first, of course, was a workshop that I had known about for other reasons for years. Of course, Joanna Macy's work that reconnects, and that has its own usefulness, and it's own style. And unfortunately, it's not an ongoing program. It is not an actual building in my community, like you were just saying. Like, you'd have an actual resilience center, but it was a great place to start. And I found the same with Bob Doppelt's work, that there is a real difference. And he's one of the few people that I respect how he defines transformation when it comes to human experience. Um, in my experience, a lot of folks use the word transformation really cavalierly, like where it's at best sort of change, awkward change, perhaps. And I think it's something far more extensive than that, far closer to the old caterpillar turns into a butterfly, and that can't be a comfortable experience for the caterpillar. To completely go into jelly. It's like, oh my God. So what I really appreciate about what you're sharing is you are in a rich area, literally, but an area rich in resources, inner and outer resources because of that. And so you actually do have a possibility of realizing something like a resilience center.
Right.
And I think you and I could both guess at how possible that is in the average county, in the average state in America. And I just would be willing to bet it's just not happening, like, ever. You've shared what I was hoping you would share, which is a bit more about how do you upscale, literally like take it to a larger scale, your impact, what you're bringing is so very valuable. And yet working one-on-one or with one family or one young person in a family at a time, that can be uh, extraordinarily small if you've got a lot that you're dreaming into, that you're imagining, that you're wanting to bring to your community. Maybe, unless there's something again that you would like to just sort of put a capper on this section, and where you were sharing with us how that might happen, how that expansion of your contribution to the community and so on could happen. Anything you'd like to say to complete that round, I'd love it. And I'd love to just perhaps have a last chapter here of looking together into what do you see on the horizon? What are you concerned about? What actually brings you some inspiration, that sort of thing. But first, anything to kind of wrap up where we've been? I don't want to rush you through anything, so.
Well, I think when you had invited me to talk, one of the things that you had wanted to talk more about was what it's like to parent in these times, and
Yes, yes.
how challenging that is. And my experience both as a parent and as a professional trying to support parents
Mhm.
is that really, even before we were experiencing this level of frequent catastrophic events, um, we do not live in a culture that supports raising young children.
Right.
It's, um, neoliberal capitalism does not really hold value in the people who are too young to produce or consume on their own, and the work of nurturing within the home has always been left off of the capitalist equation. It's always been invisible and therefore not valued. And in my experience working with so many people transitioning, I talk about a transition, like transitioning into parenthood.
Mhm.
Um, it is such a challenge to land in a role that every part of our genetic messaging, every part of the evolution of our brains says this is meant to be done in a community of people who um, can also help take care of this very young, very vulnerable being
Mhm.
and take care of you. Um, and then we're isolated in, at best, nuclear families. The hardest conversations I have are with people whose partners are working multiple jobs and they're really home alone almost all the time with
Mhm.
very young children. And then, there's not even paid parental leave. Then you have women who are, forced to go back to work in almost no time, and there's not enough childcare, and that's not funded. I mean, I could go on and on about all of that stuff that's already been really broken and problematic up until now,
Mhm.
and really led to a situation for parents where I feel like we're being asked to be far too many people at once. Like,
Mhm.
this is another piece of information from Bruce Perry, but he defines us as being in a culture of relational poverty, which I think really strikes home for me, makes a lot of sense. And that because we evolved in tribes or kind of extended family groups, where there would be a lot of caregivers, the ratio of caregivers per very young child was very high. It was like, 4 to 1. If you count the 6-year-olds and up, anybody who could care for a younger child, there were a lot of them around. And now we send our kids to childcare and we think like 1 to 8 is good.
Mhm.
It is like we are so far from the relational needs of our brains. And then when we're at home with our children in a nuclear family, we're really trying to hold too many relational roles for them in just 1 or 2 adults. And everything about the last 5 to 10 years has just made that worse. COVID was so isolating. Again, smoke or floods. There's so many reasons why we're being stuck at home without our communities right now. And so parenting, even for people who are not quite at the place where they're looking at collapse or recognizing that the world their children are growing up into is going to be a lot harder than the one that they
Mhm.
grew up in. Even if they're not quite at that place of that level of cognitive dissonance, it is just really stressful and hard to be a parent
Yeah.
right now in this
Yeah.
culture. And so I want to say that because I think um it's so important that any community resource that is looking to support children looks at the whole family, and seeks to support parents and provide
Mhm.
connection and community for parents as well, because we can't do it in a vacuum.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like there are a few really big elephants in the room in this conversation. A couple that you haven't mentioned, but I know that they're right there, like just healthcare in general. And then there's mental health care as a subset of that. The scarcity of affordable and rightly subsidized uh, childcare. It just needs to be a part of our culture. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself looking out at that horizon already, but I really appreciate you um, mentioning the things that you're mentioning. Anything else to for
Um,
that particular piece? And I still would like to spend a little bit of time looking out at that horizon together.
yeah.
But
Well, one other thing I will add, and I think it then moves us into talking
okay,
about the horizon.
yeah,
You mentioned the metamorphosis
hmm,
as a way of kind of defining the level of transition we're in, and having had all this wonderful opportunity to see the world through the eyes of a midwife, I just think about birth
hmm,
all the time, and is there is a period of time when people are experiencing, I'm going to use the word natural birth because really um birth that is not heavily intervened with, where we just absolutely assume we cannot do it. Like, it is too painful, it is too hard, it is absolutely not going to happen. And as a midwife or a doula, we like look to that moment of like, oh yeah, this means the baby's coming soon. Like, it's gotten that hard. That's actually a good sign of progress. And I think there is much, we could talk forever about the medical system. Like, there's much that has
hmm,
been gained by intervening with birth in order to make it safer.
yeah,
It is only safer for certain segments of the population. We have really high maternal and infant mortality rates, especially for Black people, but that is a whole nother conversation.
right,
Um, but there's also a lot of loss, and not so few people have been able to witness or sit with that experience when it's not intervened with, that the metaphor doesn't even like mean much anymore
mm,
unless you're someone like me. But like, there is a like, we are going through the birth canal, like we are in this moment of, it just feels tight, it feels impossible, it feels like there's no way, and something's going to be on the other side of that. I have no idea what,
yeah,
Yeah.
indeed, indeed. So do you have enough juice in you to take a look at that horizon together for
Yeah,
just a few moments before we close it up?
sure.
So what I'm after with that is, I know it's no surprise because this is sort of how it went in our earlier first conversation, just getting to know one another. Given everything we've talked about, and it seems like there's a quite it, it feels like good uh, context has been laid out of where you're coming from, where I'm coming from, what my work is, what your work is, and and so on. Um, and we've even nudged into, what is just chronically not working in this culture to begin with. And I think we are in a time like no other in human history. This is global. Yes, I mean we're going to have all of our focus on the local or regional, of course, but it is global. And in my experience of being hyper focused on human caused collapse of both Earth and human systems, as I discovered in the middle of writing that book I mentioned, it's all happening so much faster. It's accelerating and it's intensifying, no matter what we're talking about. And so, I'm just curious if you could share a little bit about what concerns you in that kind of a way when you're looking at those it's on the
Mhm.
horizon that are accelerating and intensifying.
Mm.
And then perhaps we could balance that with a bit of, do you see elements that are inspiring, elements that really bring you? I'm It's very rare that I use the word hope because I think it's abused and it's inappropriate in the vast majority of conversations and settings, but something that brings you more aliveness, something that has you feel more connected with your, again, inner resources and outer resources, and especially with those you love around you. So would you mind answering both of those as much or as little as you'd like?
Sure. And both and absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I I mean the things that concern me the most, uh, I just all of the beings that are vulnerable, which I mean, really that's every single one of us. It's all 8 billion humans and all the other, billions of living creatures.
Mhm.
I'm concerned for all of life, I guess, and not
Mm.
that I think all of life is going to end, just that there's going to be suffering. And I when there's suffering, particularly of children and other living beings, it just wrecks me. So I think my biggest concerns are about that. It's about all of the ones in who really did not have agency or power or choice in, and we could say that's all of us in some ways,
Mhm.
certainly
Mhm.
more marginalized. The more marginalized our identities, the more it is so. But then, young children and other living beings just did not
Yeah.
participate in this system, and they're going to suffer a lot, and
Mhm.
that's really hard for me.
Yeah.
uh, and so with that, and then I think particularly my concerns for children. So first of all, the suffering, but then also, like, um how do we help them grow into, like, their best potential selves, like, through that, and in spite of that, my biggest fear, I think, is that we're just going to be hit by trauma after trauma. And I read a little blog piece recently by a campfire survivor. That was the fire in Paradise that wiped out
Yes.
that whole town. And
Mhm.
he was talking about the compassion fatigue that they experienced in Chico, the next town
Yep.
over a period of time, because, like, having all those people from Paradise show up in Chico completely overloaded all of Chico's resources, like, from water to housing to, you name it. That city
Mhm.
was not prepared to get that
Mhm.
influx of neighbors. And so that's just one example, of the more of this we see, the more compassion fatigue there is, the harder it is to track, and the
Mhm.
harder it is to recover. So, like, in my own community, uh, the movement that people were making as individuals to get back to baseline after Tubbs got really disrupted the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that. I don't even remember what my baseline before Tubbs was at this point,
Yeah.
because it's, so far gone. Um, and so I worry that the parts of our brains that we use in reaction to life or death situations and repeated trauma are not the ones, not the same parts of our brains that we use to solve complex problems and connect in healthy community. And that we're kind of, in addition to everything else, setting ourselves up to have this generation of people who are going to be left with this and not having the capacity necessarily to figure out what to do. And so that's really where the heart of my work is. Like,
Yeah.
how do
Yeah.
we build this resilience? How do we build these brains and this sense of resilience in these children? um and in terms of, I mean, there's so much that inspires me and kind of catches me,
Mhm.
um, which mostly is about community. I got really involved in the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is how I met our mutual
Mhm.
friend, Mark. Um, and that was just, it brought me so much grace to realize that I wasn't alone in, all of these questions that I was having about where my profession has been until now and how we can best use our skills for the future. Turns out there's tons of people asking that question. And now we're working together and I have no idea what's going to come of it, but it feels so much better. Um,
Yeah.
and and then, like I mentioned, that leadership institute I did here locally, all of a sudden I was surrounded by people actually face to face in person
Yeah.
who in their own professions were asking similar questions. And I am so resourced by relationships,
Yeah.
even just like the other day, I was in such a bad mood when I showed up at my friend's birthday party and I left feeling so much lighter. I just
Yeah.
like, I count on that, and
Yeah.
so that continues to be where I think I find the most um solace. And then
Mhm.
also, I really do love Joanna Macy. Um,
Mhm.
I really like when I'm feeling my worst, I just pull up, any talk I can find of hers online and stick it in my earbuds,
Yeah.
because there's that perspective, I think, of the fact that we are part of something bigger and that we are not meant to know the outcome and that we just, keep um setting ourselves on the side of life. Every morning I do a short meditation and I just ask the earth, like, how can I best be of service? Like, what is the direction you need me to go? You know,
Mm, mm,
and
mhm.
so I think those are the things that guide me right now.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I love what you just said about you're so very resourced by relationship. And that's I gotta just cop to it. That's what does it for me right after my own version of a connection with nature. And these are simple things. These are simple things that are really built into our world so that you don't have to be wealthy. You don't have to be in the ideal community, uh, in a wealthy community, and so on and so on. These are things that we can, in our own mini transformative way, turn it from, well, yeah, I got some relationships in my life, okay, to, yeah, I actually, every time I'm with Jenni, I I know that I'm going to be a whole lot less grumpy than when I went in. I know it's going to happen because that's who we are together, like that. I've been noticing for about 8 years now. I've also been doing a very regular, like weekly, um, safe circle call, which is a drop-in style support group about these issues that we're talking about. And in this past year, and especially in these past few months, we've really started to shift to where we always take the time not only to check in at the beginning, but also to check in at the end, like a landing. Like, what am I landing with? And more consistently, uh, everybody is checking out better than when they came in, no matter how grumpy they might have been or sad or whatever. And I just feel very, very grateful for those simpler and ubiquitous elements that we can actually turn into resources with very little effort.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so Jenny, I thank you so much for taking this time. This for me is the for quite a while now in doing this podcast. These are the kind of you're the kind of guest I want to have here, and this is the kind of conversation I want to have because it's daily life, because it's really reachable. It's not, somebody who's been on the lecture circuit and, has all these books and highfalutin stuff that's a bit difficult to relate to for a person like myself who's, just a regular guy. This is a chance to share some of our own inner resources, or if we are new to this conversation, to learn about some and to grow them out a little bit. So just thank you. And I think that Windsor or the greater Santa Rosa area is very, very lucky to have you. And it's really a pleasure to have you here. And hopefully, I'll be able to see you at the Bates Motel when we next get together.
Definitely. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure, and I do look forward to seeing you again.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you for joining us in another episode of the Poetry of Predicament. This podcast is produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance. Living Resilience exists to offer transformative support and resources to the collapse-aware and collapse-acceptant communities around the world. Our sole purpose is to curate and offer coaching, support groups, courses, and events that assist people in expanding their core skills, competencies, and capacities for facing a troubled, predicament-laden, yet still ineffably miraculous world.